Hi there, my name is Ross Comfort. I'm a deputy head down in Kent, and I've been an English teacher for just over 10 years now, focusing mainly on GCSE and A-level English literature and language. And today I'm going to talk you through one of the other poems in the GCSE Anthology from OCR in the conflict section. So I've done a few of these as well. So what I'm going to do is talk you through this poem today, and hopefully it will help you in your preparations for your exams this year. So today we're going to have a look at a poem called The Man He Killed by a chap called Thomas Hardy. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. So I've got a short presentation to go through. And what I've done on this one is slightly different. We're going to go through it stanza by stanza rather than section by section, but you'll see what I mean in just a moment. As I say at the beginning of all of these, no matter what exam board you are with, but particularly with OCR, the things you need to consider in terms of your analysis of poetry are those on the screen there. So the context, only a little bit, particularly with OCR. You just need to touch on the context, and the big marks are for your analysis of language, form and structure, and we'll talk about all of those elements with regard to this poem as we go through today. So the context of The Man He Killed, slightly different to some of the other war poems in this section of the anthology. This is actually from, or referring to, a soldier returning from the Boer War. So the other poems we've looked at have been the World Wars. This is actually the Boer War in South Africa. Now, Thomas Hardy didn't actually fight in this war, which was ran from 1899 to 1902. But Hardy was alive during this. He died in 1928. So he would have seen the impact of this war on perhaps some of his relatives, possibly, or people he certainly knew. So he's perhaps arguably less reliable in the sense that it's not like a Keith Douglas or a Wilfred Owen who were actually soldiers and physically themselves fought in a war. But he would have noticed the impact of war as a whole. Throughout this poem, as you'll see, what he does is he reflects through this persona about that. It's about the impact that conflict and war can have on an individual, and that's what we'll focus on today. So as I say, we're going to look at language, form and structure. In previous videos I've broken it down into language, form and structure differently, but I thought I'd do something different with this poem. We're going to go through it stanza by stanza, and we'll try and look at all three elements sort of per stanza, if you like. There is obviously some overlap as we go. But the first stanza here: had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. Nipperkin's sort of a reference to a drink. So we open with a rhyme scheme, the A-B rhyme scheme. That's when alternate lines rhyme, so met, wet, in, nipperkin, for example. And it starts off with almost this sort of jolly tone, which is enhanced by the colloquial language, colloquial sort of chatty language. And you notice that because the stanzas are actually framed in speech marks. So it's Hardy again actually showing that it's direct speech from this persona. And we have this exclamation mark after the end of nipperkin, referring to a drink. So it opens very sort of, as I say, sort of quite jolly, quite light-heartedly. But of course, the content of the poem soon changes. So the word but and should, these are suggestions that perhaps something is awry. Even though we open with this jolly tone and this sort of lightheartedness, actually, this is what should have happened. This is what life should be like. However, that in itself suggests that there's an alternate reality, which Hardy then goes on to explore. Some old ancient inn is quite flippant. It's sort of, oh, just some pub. There's no specificity with this. And actually that idea of flippancy, this idea that we don't really know, we sort of pass things over without really considering the seriousness of them, that repeats throughout the poem. And the ancient inn, we have these connotations of coziness. Okay, you imagine sort of the roaring fire and sort of the dark oak wood and the sort of the ales on tap and things like that. It's a very sort of cozy British image, isn't it? An ancient inn where we sort of hunker down, particularly at Christmas time. I've got tints up behind me. We go to the pub and we have a nice time being all comfy and cozy in a nice pub there. And it's a real juxtaposition, as many war poems have in them, the juxtaposition being the contrast of two different images. On the one hand here, the ancient cozy inn, and on the other, the real stark, horrific nature of war and death. So we have this juxtaposition existing here. Oh, sorry, that's the link to the rhyme scheme. The second stanza, but ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him and he at me and killed him in his place. Now, this is a key stanza, the second one. It's a very simple, almost flippant, as I said earlier, very simple stanza. Look at the lack of adjective, the lack of description in here. He's simply telling us he was an infantryman. They looked at each other. They shot at each other. I killed him. Now, the lack of emotion there is Hardy suggesting that this is what war does to human beings. It emotionally stunts them. It desensitizes them, much like Vergish and Keith Douglas. There's a desensitization to conflict and death and war, which of course is a real sort of damaging impact that it can have on human beings. We've got the repetition of the rhyme scheme, so that A-B rhyme scheme, which we've said already gives it that sort of innocent, jolly tone. And I've sort of added to that here, saying it's almost like a nursery rhyme. If you think about those classic nursery rhymes, the rhythm and the rhyme here, echoes of a nursery rhyme. And again, there's that juxtaposition in the form then. Nursery rhymes often about, yes, they contain a moral, a lot of them, interestingly, but actually normally about innocent things like animals or whatever it might be. But this, of course, is talking about something arguably the most serious element in the case of killing and taking another life. But this is, again, what Hardy's trying to convey, is that conflict and war impacts and jars every element of life, even that of poetry. We can describe this as a dramatic monologue. If you're studying drama as well, you'll be familiar with this term. But essentially, it's a monologue, a speech from one person, the first person. As shown by the pronoun I there. So we know that this persona in the poem here is talking from his own experiences, not Hardy. So we have to refer to this as the persona, person with an A on the end, persona, because this is how he's feeling. But Hardy is commenting on the impact that war has on this person, and then by extension, the impact it has on all soldiers involved in conflict. More flippancy and the simplicity with this sing-song rhythm, which we've touched upon. I shot at him and he at me and killed him in his place. You've just taken a man's life, and yet there's a real lack of emotion there due to the fact that this is what conflict does. It emotionally damages those involved. He does not give details about the man. Again, it's just the pronoun he and him. And even after he's killed him, they're still strangers. He still doesn't know much about this man, or vice versa. And then he goes on to muse, as we'll see, essentially about why this has happened. I shot him dead because he was my foe, just so. My foe, of course, he was. That's clear enough. Although, and this dramatic monologue continues, it's almost like this persona is talking through his thoughts. And we see the first sort of faltering here due to this hyphen and then the repetition of the word because he can't really justify why he's killed him. I shot him dead because, and then that hyphen represents this pause of thought. Well, why did I kill him? Well, because he was my foe, or because he was my enemy. But he can't think of any other good reason as to why he actually killed this man, to justify the taking of another life, simply because they were an enemy in war. And it's the first time he describes the enemy the man he killed in any way as being his enemy. We don't get any other description of him. He touches on the fact he might be an infantryman before, but actually the fact he's his enemy is the only real description we get of him. We have this internal rhyme of so and foe, and the repetition of foe there, but so and foe in the third line. And again, with the hyphen and that internal rhyme, it's the faltering of this dramatic monologue, this inner monologue that he's conveying now. He's trying to almost rationalize this process of death and killing, but he's really struggling. And the reason that Hardy has done this is because he's saying, actually, there is no real justification for killing like this. if this man himself, who's actually taken life, can't even fathom why it is that he's able to take a life, then what hope do the rest of us have in terms of trying to rationalize this? There is no place for conflict and war. If we can't justify the taking of another life, then why are we doing it? And at the end of the stanza, we have this enjambment, the lines run into each other. So you'll see at the previous 3 lines, we have some punctuation at the end of the lines. They're called end stop lines. The enjambment, from the word French jambe, means it runs into the next line. Okay, and this is where we get the sense of not quite rhythm, but I suppose it is the rhythm of his inner monologue. It's a thought process, although, and then he goes on into the next stanza. So he tries to justify what he'd done, but all he knows is of the man that he's killed is that he's just a perfect stranger to him. And then this thought process carries on. Although he thought he'd list, perhaps, meaning enlist, offhand, like just as I was out of work, had sold his traps, no other reason why. So he's now thinking about this man. The phrase offhand makes it seem, again, flippant and like a very casual idea. Oh, I might just sign up to go fight for the war because actually I've got no work, I've got no purpose in life, I may as well. It's a kind of that, again, flippancy there. Very relaxed again. He's thinking, actually sort of thinking this through. There's, again, real lack of emotion and arguably remorse in this. But he is being quite reflective as to why he's there. And then we start to get some of these similarities between the 2 men. So the man he killed and the persona, the person who did the killing. Now, just like him, he was out of work. They both signed up, perhaps, because they were both out of work and sold all their belongings. We get more hyphens, okay, just like in the previous stanza where he's beginning to falter through this thought process. But it adds the effect of natural speech. It adds the effect of this person thinking through the process of killing. And the increase in the number of stanzas, it's almost like this person's getting more emotional. We saw in the second stanza with the lack of adjectives, it's very matter of fact. I killed him and that was that. But now he's starting to think about it and the impact of conflict. Now he's starting to become a little bit more emotional and a little bit more reflective about that, quite rightly as well. And he then begins to try and rationalize this. There's no other reason why he killed him other than he was the enemy, because if I don't kill him, he's going to kill me. There was no other reason why. And it's Hardy's comment on conflict and war, what it does to people. There's no real justification for this killing. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down, you treat if met where any bar is, or help to half a crown. Now, you'll see here the hyphens have disappeared. And that first yes, followed by the semicolon, which is a caesura being a pause in the line of a poem, often sort of highlighted by a piece of punctuation like a semicolon or an exclamation mark or whatever. But yes, it's almost like he's made up his mind. He's almost talking this thought process to himself. And then he says, yes, that's what it is. He's composed himself. Therefore, the hyphens that were sort of signifying this emotional breakdown have disappeared. Quaint and how quaint and curious war is. Okay, he's just saying, well, that's just what war is like. You shoot a fellow down, you treat where any bar is. Actually, you shoot at the man and he shoots you. That actually, if you met in any other circumstance, you'd actually buy a drink or you'd lend him some money, half a crown. We again have the same rhyming pattern that continues throughout. So this same juxtaposition of the form, the nursery rhyme sort of esque form, and the very simplified sort of almost, again, flippant sort of tone, the jolly tone, versus the content, what's actually being spoken about, which is the killing of a man for no real good reason. And again, all of this is Hardy, the poet, trying to say and force the reader to reflect and say, well, why on earth do we have wars? If we can't justify and rationalize the killing of another person, and we only say, well, we killed him just because he's the enemy, why on earth do we do it? We then have this introduction of a second person through the pronoun you. Before it was a lot of I, and that sort of inner thought process. But then all of a sudden it's almost like this persona is actually talking to another person in a pub, perhaps in an ancient inn, sharing a drink, who knows? But it's almost like this person is talking to another, saying, well, this is why I did it, and this is what I think about that. Again, trying to rationalize the process of it. The half a crown is just indicative of the time period, which is sort of turn of the century there. Now, some general tips just to finish with. As I've said in sort of previous little lessons here, no matter what quotation you select to answer whatever question, you've got to explain the effect it has on the reader, and possibly why the poet was doing that. And hopefully I've tried to do that a few times. Every time I pick out a device, that's only the first job. You've then got to explain the effect that that has on the reader in order to get the marks. And similarly, be smart with your quotation selection. If you're able to pick out a single quotation where you can discuss the language, form and structure through that single quotation, it allows you to expand on your ideas, particularly in a very time-pressured environment like an exam. It means you've not got to then select several quotations to cover language, form and structure. You're able to pick those things apart from a single quotation. So just be smart with the quotations that you select. And I'll leave you with a practice question, which you can have a look at. Explore how the poet explores the pointlessness of war. So again, we touched on this as we've analysed the poem, and a general sort of tip that I give to my students in terms of how to structure analytical essays around poetry. Introduce the poem with a very brief summary of what the poem is about and a little bit about the context, only 3 or 4 sentences needed, and then go straight into your analysis of language, form and structure. I always suggest 3P paragraphs: point, evidence, explain. You might have done different versions of that, but essentially 3 separate differing points about, in this case, how the poet explores the pointlessness of war, quotations smartly selected to support your idea, and then analyze the language, form and structure of each of those quotations. So essentially, how does your quotation prove your point about, in this case, the pointlessness of war? But that general structure, as I've said previously, is a really good one to follow when you're analysing any poetry from any section. Just think about that general structure, particularly come exam time, and you should do rather well, I would hope. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that useful. And as I say, there's some other videos out there that I've done on this same section in a very sort of similar format. So if you did find it useful, maybe go and have a look at those as well. Thanks very much again. Good luck. And I shall hopefully speak to you all again soon. Thank you very much.